Welcome to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw, the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University, where I'm also a professor of school psychology there. We're going to talk a little bit today about social justice and how this construct has good and bad features for making research relevant. I say this is where my specific expertise as a school psychologist comes into play, because this has affected school psychology and to a large degree counseling psychology as well, perhaps more than other fields. And it has potential to be a real positive force in moving research towards being more relevant for everybody. Now, first of all, the label's pretty interesting, of social justice. Well, what is it? It sounds great. I mean, it sounds like something we all should be for, right? We have, justice is a good thing. Social justice in terms of how we work with minoritized populations or racialized populations or, LGBTQ populations. All of these topics, justice for these populations is something we are all for. I shouldn't say that. Maybe I'm overgeneralizing there. Most of us are for it. It sounds like a very good thing. And this is where we get into trouble with research versus movement towards social movements. It's really a social movement rather than research at this point. But what's happened, especially in school psychology, is that school psychology has become really quite sensitive because, remember, our profession has a long history of using intelligence tests. Intelligence tests are, and there's a whole other discussion, but rightly or wrongly, well, we'll get to it a little bit later, rightly or wrongly blamed for putting a disproportionate number of black students into special education classrooms because intelligence tests are part of the criteria for inclusion in these classrooms. Intelligence tests also have a long history of being involved with eugenics. All of the great early 20th century scholars in the field were very much eugenicists and involved in professional organizations that supported eugenics. That's not a great look. That's something that hasn't aged very well. It doesn't really mean their ideas were wrong when it comes to the technical aspects of measuring intelligence, but it does make us look at those things very carefully. And then there's been a whole bunch of legal cases involved on how we should use intelligence tests and how school psychologists should function. We even had a president of the National Association of School Psychologists, and this is an American association, that's written clearly that school psychology should atone for the damage it's done to black children. This is a pretty controversial aspect, but I think it's becoming more mainstream in the field. And so now we're seeing, but what we're saying in terms of more relevance, we can talk about how this affects a professional field, but more relevant to what I'm talking about here is how it affects the relevance of research and how it affects our practice or theories or what have you. There's been a lot of papers published on the topic of social justice. Now, not all of them are scientific papers. We have to remember that scholarly journals are not scientific journals for the most part. There's often things in those journals that are not science. They're scholarship, they're histories, they're opinions, they're other things. They may all be called research papers, but in fact, they're not really research. And most of the papers on social justice are not really research papers. There are some qualitative papers, as we talked about earlier, about inductive reasoning types of papers, which are qualitative or surveys. But there's no real theory to this. We don't really have very good definitions of what social justice is. My view is that it's a very good thing, something we should aspire to as we provide service delivery to children and adolescents and communities. It's a very good thing, but right now it's not science. There are really no theories or models. There's very little in terms of hypothesis testing. The most hypothesis testing you'll see about social justice is, do we think it's important? I did some research. Actually, it was on an entirely different topic, but some of the data we looked at really showed that most school psychologists, when it comes to should we implement ideas, what did they value most about implementing an idea? It was very interesting that at least half the people felt it was more important that we do a social justice adjacent or social justice agreeing intervention, that was more important than whether it worked. And many psychologists were talking, school psychologists were talking about they have a choice sometimes between something that's a social justice consistent idea and something with evidence supporting it. And they felt they had to make a decision rather than it's all part of the same thing. I really think that social justice ideas are so good and so positive for the field as long as we treat it as potentially a framework to move it ahead, rather than if we put the label social justice on it, it's good. In fact, I look at it, we got a little jingle jangle adjacent things. I see a lot of things put with the label social justice, not really social justice. And on the other hand, I see a lot of things that don't talk about social justice that really are. It's a vague word. We all agree it's good. There's some potential here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can make this rather vague concept that, to be honest, and to some degree, we're starting to see it compete for journal pages with scientific papers. There's a limited number, and that's fine. I was given this wonderful assignment by somebody I have an incredible amount of respect for. We have a book in school psychology. It's referred to as Best Practices in School Psychology. I never really liked the name of it very much because best practices is something you do in agriculture or engineering. It's not what professionals tend to do. Nonetheless, it's a really good book because it does put together a lot of great ideas. Some of these books have been 5 or 6 volumes. It comes out about every 7 or 8 years. And I always write for it because, not that I really think it's best practices is a great construct, but what I do think about it is that that's kind of where the leaders publish, so I kind of want to be adjacent to the leaders. But this person had a wonderful idea, the editor for this term around. Her idea was all papers, no matter what, had to have a social justice lens. And I thought, oh, that's cool. And then I was asked to do something that I have expertise on, which is looking at low incidence disabilities, mostly genetic disorders and things of that nature. That's my expertise, or people with more severe to profound intellectual disabilities. Often the paper in best practices that's on that topic tends to be more medical, more kind of technical in terms of that regard. But the charge was to give it a social justice lens. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's going to be difficult. But actually, it was one of the best exercises I had. And I think I've got some ideas that might help social justice really improve the relevance of science and improve the true social justice. So I'm going to share that with you. This is kind of based on that chapter that we wrote in Best Practices in School Psychology. Whatever the last one came out, it's like 2023, 2024, I can't remember. But it really just divides social justice in terms of how you conduct your research methods in terms of 3 things. One is access, context, and community. And to some degree, it kind of helps, when you think of these things, it sort of helps make research have a more implementation component to it, maybe a little bit more hybrid. Because right now, I'm afraid anything with the phrase social justice is just accepted quickly without evidence. So moving the profession away from evidence-based practices, because there's this clamor to support minoritized groups that have been treated abysmally by schools over the years, and not just schools, mental health services too. So if we think of access, context, and community as our 3 constructs that we look at. We look at when we produce information, are we disseminating? Are we giving people access to it? I'm not just talking paywall versus open access, although that's part of it. I'm also talking, can we communicate on how this information can be used in practice? In other words, is it accessible? Not just technically is it accessible? Is it something that we have detailed methods on so that those methods could be adopted in a real life situation? Do we understand for whom are these things important? And that's where we're talking about access. So access to the information. Are we getting this information to the right people to make decisions for everybody? Other is context. This happens all the time, that we have information out there that is something works, a reading or a therapy or something like that. These types of interventions work for some people in some situations at some times. We've talked about this in the past. What it allows us to do is really ensure that the context is relevant to a lot of people, including minoritized populations, low-income populations, other folks who've just been marginalized out in education. Is this part of your research? It's not just an aside. It has to be a core feature of the research. And if that's the case, we're getting closer to social justice. And the third one is kind of almost not totally orthogonal to context, but it's community. Are we considering the larger community involved? Community acceptance, community concern for the problem at hand? Are we considering these when we take up a research question or in the way we answer it? If we take these very carefully, access, context, community, we're really closer to a social justice idea. Not only a social justice idea, but it's actually building to make research more relevant. Because honestly, we make some pretty bad decisions to try to solve serious problems. My favorite example right now is GREs for admission to graduate school. The idea was that it's biased against minoritized populations. And even though there's not really much evidence of that, of true bias, again, bias is a technical thing, it's not an opinion. There are technical ways to assess bias, and there's really not a lot of evidence of bias. But the point is, are we going to have a better representation of the community in our graduate programs if we get rid of the GRE? It's always been assumed so. But in fact, that's not the case. What we're seeing is almost every time we look at it, it's the opposite issue. That in fact, when we get rid of the GREs, what we're seeing is less minoritized or racialized populations in graduate school, because that was the most equal status. Because if you don't look at GREs, what you're forced to look with is grades. And we know there is bias in university grades. There's plenty of evidence of this. We do know are you going to have good letters of recommendation from people when in fact many minoritized populations do not have the financial stability that it takes to volunteer to be in a lab. Many have to work. So they're not going to have undergraduate publication, which a ridiculous number of applicants to graduate schools have. So they're not going to have letters of recommendation. The grades they have a bias against. GREs was the only equal playing field. Is it equal totally? No, not really, because it's expensive. Access to taking the GREs is a barrier. However, it still reduces the friction involved in graduate schools by quite a bit. So we're seeing some actually programs that got rid of the GREs to come back to it. But the point's not about the GREs. The point is about making good decisions with data, as opposed to making decisions because it sounds good. If we're going to be evidence-based, let's do it. Let's create a relevant research agenda that is evidence-based, that can be applied, that can be implemented. And right now, social justice, I'm concerned that it's sort of at a tipping point. It could just be all things good and being used as a bludgeon and being used to make some decisions that aren't particularly good and not achieving the goals they wish, the proponents of social justice theories. I shouldn't say theories because they're not really theories, but social justice ideas. On the other hand, they're really onto something really important, which is research needs to have full access. Everybody who's going to be using it needs to have access to it. It needs to consider the context, whether it's the demographics, whether that's the resources, whether it's the systems involved. Consider those contexts, the languages involved, all of these things. And it needs to engage in community. If research can do those three things, what we have now is a social justice-driven research agenda that is far more relevant than if we ignored social justice. So I hope we go in that direction because I would love to see research more relevant, and I think social justice has potential to be a major component in making all of our research far more relevant. So let's go with that. I hope that one, I suppose that's going to be a little controversial. I might have some people yelling at me for that one. But this is potential. This is good. We should not ignore social justice concepts because it's going to make our research better and more relevant. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time on Building Research Relevance.